Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Vivek. Today I'll be covering a topic around building a CI/CD pipeline using CDK for building a static website. And please do hit the subscribe button and the bell icon if you like the content that I'm preparing. Also, like and share. Thank you. Alright, I have the UI repository here in GitHub. It's under CloudPod organization. You'll see there's a CloudPod web UI repository. It's a simple create React app. It's just cloned and created from there. So there are a bunch of steps that you can follow. If you want to get started by yourself, feel free to do that. And create React app is pretty much the default script that is followed in React documentation. So you can just follow that link as well. These are some of the steps. You can go to this website. I'll share this link in the description section. npx create React app and the name of your app. And once you navigate inside it and you can do npm start, it will create the app as well as start the application for you. All right. So this is the step that you'd follow if you have to create by yourself. Or what you can do is, for easy development purposes, you can just clone this repository. You go here and you can, I'll share this GitHub URL as well in the description section. So you can go there, copy the SSH or the HTTPS command, copy it and clone this repository in your local system. And once you clone it, the next step is pretty much given in the documentation. So you can come here. The next step you should do on your local system is cd into that particular repository or local repository and then execute npm install command. npm install will pull in all the dependency. Once you see that dependency, it should show you something like this with all the build, node modules, package.json, public and src folder. Okay. Once you have completed that step, next would be, if you again go back to the README, it's pretty much given there. Execute this npm start command. So just go there, npm start, and as soon as you start, it will be running on your localhost 3000 by default. Again, that's a React React application behavior. So let's go to localhost 3000. And we have a simple app. Welcome to CloudPod. Just logo of CloudPod and this UI piece. In terms of cloud architecture, this is what we will be building today. Our code is in GitHub repository. This is where, as you can see, my cursor. This is where our GitHub repository is. In our AWS account, we'd be establishing a Codestar connection with our GitHub repository. This Codestar connection will be established manually in our use case. This is something that we do for probably once or twice. We won't be using this often. And this will be defined inside our code pipeline itself, right? So inside our code pipeline, there's a settings where we'll be actually using that settings connection to establish our connectivity between AWS account and the GitHub repository. Once we establish that, we would require an ARN. That ARN is what we'll be using in our code pipeline source connection. The code pipeline itself will have three major stages. As you can see here, one is source, second is build, and third would be the deploy stage. In the source stage, we'd be actually pulling code from GitHub. So it will actually constantly scan for changes in our GitHub repository. Every time when there is a commit into the specific branch that we are going to mention in our pipeline, let's say in our case, we're going to monitor the main branch. In that case, what will happen is code pipeline will make a check in the GitHub repository if there's any change in the master or the main branch. If let's say a new commit comes in, right? As soon as a new commit comes in, it'll basically trigger a pipeline build. And as soon as that trigger happens through that commit, or let's say could also be a case where you have a pull request coming in your GitHub repository and it gets merged. As soon as that gets merged, that's also tracked as a commit. And when that commit happens, again, that trigger is pulled by our code pipeline. It'll pull the change. It will store in a temporary artifact, which I'll show you in the code how it looks like. And that artifact will be passed on to the next stage to actually build the code. It is in this stage that it will be doing the npm install and npm build on the code base that is pulled from the previous stage, the artifact. And that artifact will further be passed on to the next stage for deployment. We call it the output artifact from build stage. The output artifact from the build stage would become like the input artifact for the deploy stage. And that deploy stage would get these files which were built and deploy it in an S3 bucket as a static file. These are going to be the top 3 stages that we're going to do in our code in CDK. We need to establish a connection between our AWS account to our code repository, which is actually in GitHub. There is a mechanism to do that, and we would be using something called Codestar by AWS that can be configured in Codepipeline. So let's go there. And once you're here, make sure you're in a region where you're going to run your code pipeline and code build as well. Okay. You can't keep your Codestar connection in Ohio region and expect your code pipeline to work in North Virginia. So you have to be very sure that if you are selecting North Virginia for your Codestar connection, make sure your code pipeline is also in that same region. Okay. And if you go to the settings section in the code pipeline, you'll see something called connections. This is where you'll be actually able to create a connection. Okay. So we're going to be using GitHub. It provides 3 different options: GitHub Cloud version, GitHub Enterprise Server, as well as Bitbucket. We're going to go with GitHub, and we're going to give a name like AWS GitHub connection. Connect to GitHub. And in my case, I already had a connection, so I'm going to just choose from that. But in your case, you will have to install a new app. And as soon as you install, it'll ask you to log into your GitHub. Once you're logged into your GitHub, it'll ask you to grant permission for your app. Once all that is done, you'll be able to select the repository for which you want to choose the connections. Okay. And there it is. Okay. So I have the GitHub connection enabled here. This is the ARN. I'm just gonna copy this. We'd be using this ARN in our code pipeline. Now we'll actually create a seed CDK project inside this cloud infrastructure folder. So the command for us to initialize a CDK project is CDK init app followed by the language of our choice. Here we're going to be using Typescript, and there it is ready. Now if I do an LSL, you'd see all of this coming up here. Okay, let's open the same in VS Code. Now in our case, as we saw, let's go back to that diagram that we had. We have our code connection already established as I showed earlier, and we have our ARN for the Codestar connection. We'll be starting with a static website. To start with that, let me get rid of all these comments first. First command I'd use is for S3. AWS S3 is the module. We're gonna name this constant as website bucket. New S3 dot bucket. Bucket. Here we're gonna give the reference to the CDK instance. That's why we're saying this. We're gonna give a name for this particular bucket. Keep in mind that S3 bucket names are global across AWS. So if I give a name like this, please don't use the same name it might overlap with my bucket name. So feel free to choose a name of your own, and that'll help you publish that bucket. Okay. In our case, we need index HTML, so we're going to name that out here, website index document, and it's going to be index.html. We also got to mention the error document, so it's going to be error.html. We'd keep the versioning to true, and last but not the least, we'll keep the public read access as true. So we have these three stages of our pipeline: source, build, and deploy. And as you know, as we pass from one stage to the other, we need input artifacts for each stage as well as output artifacts for each stage. Hence, we're going to name our artifacts in that fashion. So let's start with artifacts are a part of Codepipeline, so let's make sure we import that. First, have the output source listed out here, so we'd use Codepipeline dot artifact, and we'll use a similar naming, and we'll use a similar structure for artifact for the website as well. So we have both the web artifacts listed out here. Okay, now let's create the actual pipeline itself. Pipeline is equal to new Codepipeline dot pipeline. As I said, we're going to pass in the CDK instance, stack instance, so that's going to be this. And I gotta give a name to this pipeline, so I'd be giving as pipeline name, and I'd be naming it as React static web CI/CD pipeline. I know it's a huge name, just going with the flow. Restart execution on update, I'm going to set that to true, and that's it. So just a basic pipeline that I got started with. Now I got to add 3 stages to the pipeline: source, build, and deploy. So let's do that first, each with a stage name. So pipeline dot add stage, stage name, name it as source, actions, for now I'm going to keep it empty. Okay, I have to add 3 stages, so I'm going to rename this to source, from source to build, and last but not the least, to deploy. Right, now let's start by defining the actions inside each one of them. The first one is going to be an action to pull from GitHub, so we need to define a Codestar connection. The way we do that is using Codepipeline action. So I need to import that first. Let me get that out here. Import star as code pipeline action from AWS lib code pipeline actions. Okay, I'm gonna list that out here. Dot code star connection source. This is the one that I need, and I'm going to be defining things inside this. Action name, owner is going to be the repository owner, and next one is the repository. So, and I list that out here. I got to specify the branch, so it's going to be main branch. As you saw earlier, I pushed all my code in main branch. Output I'm going to be giving as output source. Remember the one artifact that I created above? I'll be using that out here. And connection ARN. So let's go back to our bit. Let me make sure I have the code pipeline. I'll copy the connection that we created earlier. We'll go here. I'll copy the ARN, and I would like to use that ARN out here. Okay. Now for the build stage, let's again create a new code pipeline action dot code build action. And we're gonna give this action a name. It's gonna be build UI. Project is something that we use for this particular code build environment. Import star as code build from AWS CDK lib / code build. Now that we have code build, I'm gonna use that out here. I need pipeline project. I'll be using in the CDK stack instance as reference. I'm gonna be naming this as a UI build, and in here I will have to specify an environment. Environment is the type of machine that you want for your code build environment. So in my case, I'm gonna be using a Linux instance. So it will be code build dot Linux build image, and I'm gonna use the Amazon Linux version 2 version 4 image. I'm gonna make sure I run this in a privilege mode, so I've got to give that as true. And the compute type that I'm using here is gonna be code build dot compute type dot small. I don't need a huge instance. It's gonna be a small static project, so that's fine. I have to give a project name. Let me give it a static website build, and probably the build spec file name. It's going to be code build dot build spec from source file dot / build spec dot YML. Where did I get this from? Let me show you. So if you actually see this, let's go to our UI code. In your UI code, we can see that I've already had a build spec.yaml file. If you open this, it just tells you what are the phases that's going to be within this web project. So I would require a runtime environment of Node.js version 16 at least, and it's going to have a command of npm install in the install stage. In the build phase, it'll gonna execute a command. It'll be executing a command called npm run build, and finally the artifacts, once it runs the npm run build, the artifacts are going to be from .build folder, and it's going to pick up all the files from there, right? That's why we're referring to build spec file here. I know that it's showing some errors out here, which makes sense because I didn't write the input artifact. It's expecting that, so let's book the one that we have as output from the previous stage, which is going to be the output source. So that's going to become our input source here, and let's make sure our output source is also mentioned. In our case, it's going to be the website as the artifact. For this, we would require a new Codepipeline action. So let's make sure we have that. We have it as we used earlier, and here we're going to use it as S3 deploy action. And in the deploy action, we have to give an action name, just like we mentioned above, and we're going to name it as deploying static website as the action name. Input is going to be from the previous stage, and we got to give the bucket. What was the name of the bucket we used? It's going to be website bucket. We're going to copy that from here, and we're going to paste that out here, right? That defines our third stage as well. So we have 3 different stages in our code. Now let's try to run this through CDK. Alright, before we get started with the actual CDK execution itself, make sure you have your AWS profile configured. And once you have all your AWS profile configured, you should just check by using this command sts get caller identity, just to make sure you're logged in as the right person. In my case, I am with the right account, so I'll just verify that first, followed by the actual CDK command to call CDK bootstrap. This will actually set up all the necessary IAM permissions and roles that is required for your CDK to execute in your AWS account. Looks good to me. The next command that I'm going to use is CDK synth. This will synthesize the CDK infrastructure and compare it to my AWS account. That the synth also went successful. Before I proceed ahead, let me just pull my CloudFormation stack in my AWS console. I did mention that CDK behind the scene creates CloudFormation scripts, so you would see that happening right now. I'd be executing CDK deploy command, and CDK deploy will actually generate the CloudFormation script using the code that we did earlier, convert that into a CloudFormation and deploy it in our AWS account. So you could see that happening right now. The command for that is CDK deploy, and as soon as I hit enter, it'll build a set of assets. Before it deploys, it'll ask you that, okay, based upon the code, these are the resources that it's going to create, and if I'm looking good with all the resources, I'm going to say yes, and it'll deploy the entire stack in my AWS account. If I refresh here in the CloudFormation stack, you can see the new Cloud Infra stack coming up. You can see here in the events, it's creating a bunch of these resources. You can see the same status here. There are around 20 resources that it's creating, of which 7 are right now creation completed. And I'll just fast forward to the last section. Here you can see it has just completed all the 20 resources and the CloudFormation infrastructure stack is completed successfully. Let's go back to the IAM console and just make sure. You can see the same here and the stack is ready. Now if we go to Codepipeline and we refresh, we'll see a new pipeline coming up. And as we defined earlier, we have the source stage. It pulled the code from GitHub. It's right now going through the build phase. The good thing about this is if you open this here, you can see that all the logs are also getting captured in CloudWatch. Alright, waiting for the agent. It's actually right now doing the npm install command. You can see that here as well as here in the CloudWatch as well. Now it's running the next phase, which is the npm run builds phase. And it looks like it completed that, and the artifact is also uploaded successfully. So if you see here, the build stage should now be completed. Let me just refresh this page. There you go. We have the build stage completed. Whoa, even the deploy stage is completed. Looks like that's done pretty fast. Here you can see it gives you a link to the S3 bucket as well. So there we are in the S3 bucket. It's a public bucket just as we created, and it has copied everything from the build folder. You can see the index.html file here, although we don't have the error.html, but that's fine. Let's just try to access this website. So we'll go here, we'll copy this URL. And finally, you can see here that the app is deployed as a static website in the S3 bucket. And you can see that URL here, the S3 bucket URL. This is what we've been trying to achieve.